What happens when one of the most powerful luxury car brands in the world faces off against a camera, a crashed hypercar, and a YouTuber who refuses to back down? Because this isn't just about a broken car anymore. This is about control, reputation, and a legal move that could backfire on a global scale. The automotive world is watching closely. Every upload, every response, every silence is being dissected. And at the center of it all is a single question that refuses to go away. What if Matt Armstrong pushes too far, and Bugatti decide to respond not with statements, but with lawyers? At first glance, it sounds simple. A brand protects itself. A company defends its reputation. A lawsuit gets filed. A courtroom decides the outcome. But reality doesn't work that cleanly. Because if Bugatti ever took that step, it wouldn't just be a case. It would be a war. And it's a war they might not be able to win. The story begins with a machine that was never meant to fail publicly, the Bugatti Chiron, a symbol of engineering perfection, a car built not just for speed, but for status, for exclusivity, for control. And then it crashed, not quietly, not behind closed doors, but into the hands of someone who documents everything. Matt Armstrong didn't just rebuild a car. He turned the process into a narrative, a timeline, a public investigation. Emails, phone calls, refusals, delays, contradictions, everything captured, everything uploaded. And that's where things started to shift. Because now, it wasn't just a damaged car being repaired. It was a system being questioned. Why refuse parts? Why restrict access? Why block independent repair? These aren't just technical questions. They are political ones. And once those questions go public, they don't go away. From Bugatti's perspective, this isn't just inconvenient, it's dangerous. Because luxury brands don't just sell products. They sell perception. Control over their image is everything. And that image relies on a simple idea: perfection. No shortcuts. No compromises. No unauthorized interference. But here's the problem. The moment you step into a courtroom, you lose control of the narrative. And that's where the real risk begins. To win a case against Matt Armstrong, Bugatti wouldn't just need to disagree with him. They would need to prove something far more difficult. That he lied, knowingly, intentionally, with the goal of damaging their reputation. That's not a PR argument. That's a legal standard. And it's incredibly hard to meet. Because Matt didn't just talk. He showed footage of the car, documentation of the process, screenshots of communication, real-time updates. He framed his experience not as absolute truth, but as what happened to him. And in most legal systems, that matters a lot, because there's a line between defamation and opinion. And crossing that line is not easy, especially when evidence exists. Now imagine this scenario. Bugatti files a lawsuit. Headlines explode overnight. Luxury giants use YouTuber. Hypercar maker targets independent builder. Right to repair battle reaches caught. The narrative writes itself. And suddenly, Bugatti isn't a symbol of precision anymore. It becomes a corporation trying to silence criticism. And Matt Armstrong, he becomes something else entirely. The underdog, the builder, the voice of independent ownership. That shift alone is powerful. But it's only the beginning. Because once legal action starts, something even more dangerous begins. Discovery. This is a phase where both sides are forced to open their doors. Not publicly, but legally. Emails, internal discussions, policies, strategies. Everything becomes accessible. And that's where things can spiral. Because what companies say internally is rarely what they say publicly. Imagine internal discussions about restricting part sales, about controlling repair networks, about protecting brand value over accessibility. Even if those decisions are standard business strategy, seeing them written plainly, without PR filters, changes everything. And if those documents ever surfaced, the damage wouldn't be limited to one case. It would echo across the entire industry. This is why companies at this level avoid courtrooms unless absolutely necessary. Because even a win can feel like a loss. And in this case, a loss could be devastating. But the complexity doesn't stop there. Because this isn't happening in one country. It spans multiple legal systems. Matt Armstrong operates out of the UK. The rebuild connects to the US. Bugatti's roots trace back to France. Ownership ties lead to Croatia, through Matt Rimac and Bugatti Rimac. So where does the case even go? Which laws apply? Which standards define truth, speech, and liability? Each jurisdiction brings different rules, different protections, different risks, and navigating that alone could cost millions before a single argument is even heard. Now consider the business perspective. Would Bugatti spend millions to fight a case they might not win, to expose internal operations, to generate global negative press, or to silence a narrative that's already public? It doesn't make sense. And that's exactly why they haven't done it. Instead, they chose something else. Control the story without the courtroom, a public response, a carefully framed message, delivered not through legal documents, but through leadership, through voice, through explanation. When Matt Rimac addressed the situation, it wasn't random. It was strategic. The focus shifted to safety, to standards, to responsibility, not accusations, not confrontation, because legally, that's a safer path. In court, claims must be proven, but in public, perception is enough, and perception can be shaped. That's the battlefield Bugatti chose, because it's the one they can control. But even that comes with limits, because every response invites more questions. If safety is a concern, why not sell non-critical parts? If standards matter, why not provide guidelines? If control is necessary, where does ownership end? These questions don't disappear. They evolve, and with every video uploaded, they gain more attention. This is where the situation becomes something bigger. It's no longer just about one car. It's about the future of ownership, the right to repair, the balance between brand control and customer freedom. And Matt Armstrong, intentionally or not, is standing at the center of that conversation. That's why this story resonates, because it connects to something universal. Ownership. When you buy something, do you truly own it? Or are you just borrowing permission to use it? Luxury brands have always leaned toward control, restricted access, authorized networks, tight ecosystems. But the digital age changes things. Transparency is no longer optional, and narratives are no longer one-sided. A single YouTube channel can challenge a billion-dollar company, not through power, but through visibility. And visibility is something lawsuits can't easily contain. In fact, they often amplify it. There's a name for that, the Streisand effect. Try to suppress information, and you end up spreading it further, faster, wider. If Bugatti ever filed a lawsuit, the rebuild wouldn't just stay within automotive circles. It would reach mainstream media, legal analysts, consumer rights advocates, and suddenly the story grows beyond control. Every detail examined, every claim questioned, every move scrutinized. And once that level of attention begins, there's no going back. So what happens next? Most likely, nothing in court, because both sides understand the risks. Instead, this continues where it started. Online, video by video, update by update, a public battle of narratives, one side documenting, the other responding, neither fully escalating, because escalation changes everything, and not always for the better. In the end, the biggest question isn't whether Bugatti could win a lawsuit. It's whether they should even try, because winning legally doesn't guarantee winning publicly. And in today's world, public perception can matter more than any verdict. The Chiron will eventually be rebuilt. That part is inevitable. But the conversation it started, that's far from over. Because this isn't just about a car anymore. It's about power, control, and the cost of defending both. And somewhere between a workshop camera and a corporate boardroom, a new kind of battle is being defined. Not by speed, not by engineering, but by who controls the story. And right now, that story is still being written. And in the end, this was never just about a broken Bugatti Chiron sitting in a workshop. It became something far bigger, a question of control, of ownership, and of who really holds the power once the keys are handed over. Because if a car like this, built by Bugatti, engineered to perfection, sold for millions, can't be freely repaired by the person who owns it, then what does ownership actually mean? What started as a rebuild turned into a spotlight, not just on one company, but on an entire industry. And that's why the story refuses to fade, because every decision now carries weight. Every response shapes perception. Every silence speaks louder than words. For Matt Armstrong, the camera is still rolling. For Bugatti, the pressure is still building. And for everyone watching, the lines between brand authority and customer rights are becoming harder to ignore. Maybe there will never be a lawsuit. Maybe this battle never reaches a courtroom. But in many ways, it already doesn't need to, because a real verdict isn't being decided by judges. It's being decided by millions of viewers, by public opinion, by trust, and by a simple question that now echoes far beyond this one rebuild. Who really controls the story once it's out in the open? Because once that story is seen, once it's shared, once it's believed, no legal action can truly take it back. And that's the risk, not just for Bugatti, but for any brand trying to control a world that no longer stays silent. This isn't the end of the story. It's just a moment where everything changes. And what happens next will define far more than a car. And maybe that's the part most people still underestimate, because what looks like a simple dispute today can quietly turn into a defining moment tomorrow. The rebuild will finish. The engine will fire. The Bugatti Chiron will move again. But the questions it raised won't disappear with the sound of that engine. They'll follow every future owner, every independent builder, every manufacturer watching from the sidelines. Because once a boundary is tested, it can't be unseen. For Bugatti, this isn't just about one car or one creator. It's about precedent, about what happens if control slips even slightly. Because if one rebuild proves possible outside the system, then others will try. And if others try, then the model itself begins to change. Slowly, quietly, but permanently. And for Matt Armstrong, this was never just about views. It became something else entirely. A challenge, a statement, a line drawn without ever needing to say it out loud. And that's what makes this story so powerful. No courtroom, no verdict, no official ruling. Yet somehow, the impact is already real. Because millions have seen it. Millions have formed opinions. And in a world driven by attention, that might matter more than any legal win. This is how modern battles are fought. Not behind closed doors, but in public, frame by frame, upload by upload. And every time the story grows, it becomes harder to control, harder to contain, harder to reverse. So even if a lawsuit never happens, the risk still exists. Because the longer this continues, the more the narrative solidifies, the more people begin to ask, why? Why restrict? Why control? Why not adapt? And those questions don't need a courtroom to create pressure. They create it on their own. That's the reality brands face today. Not just defending products, but defending perception. And perception doesn't follow legal rules. It follows belief. And belief is shaped by what people see. Right now, they are watching a rebuild that wasn't supposed to happen, a process that wasn't meant to be public, and a story that refuses to stay quiet. So whether Bugatti ever steps into court or continues to fight this in silence, one thing is already certain. This moment has changed the conversation about cars, about ownership, about power, and about what happens when control meets transparency. Because once transparency wins attention, it rarely gives it back. And that's where the real tension lies. Not in what's been said, but in what can't be unsaid. Not in what's been shown, but in what can't be unseen. This isn't just a chapter in a rebuild story. It's a turning point. And long after the car is finished, long after the headlines fade, this question will still remain. In a world where everything can be documented, everything can be shared, and everything can be challenged, can any brand truly stay in control? Or is control itself becoming the biggest risk of all? And maybe that's the real story unfolding here. Not about who wins, not about who's right, but about a shift that's already happening, one video at a time.